Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a Diablo 3 patch 2.4.2 monk build that is topping the Greater Rift solo leaderboards on the public test realm. This is a Lashing tail kick build that makes use of a new item, the Scarbringer. Well, technically it's not a new item, it's a crap item that already existed that lacked a legendary power. They've now added a legendary power to it, and it's allowing a really fun Lashing tail kick build to clear Greater Rift 96s on the leaderboard. Now I will specify that a nerf has just come into effect. The damage buff to Lashing tail kick has been reduced since those 96 clears, and it's not yet clear how many Greater Rift levels that will nerf it by, but we're likely to continue to see more iteration on this build throughout the PTR, and I'm really hoping that this Chuck Norris infinite roundhouse kick build will be viable when patch 2.4.2 goes live. We'll give you an overview of the current version of the build, but do check back in the future for any updates to find out whether this has been nerfed into the ground or it's still viable, and if it is still viable, I'll have an updated video that'll go over all the details, all the stats, all the exact gear and skills that you'll want to optimize. So first off, you're going to want the Sunwuko set. You'll be equipping 5 pieces and have 1 piece in the cube. There's no negotiation, you need shoulders, gloves, chest, amulet, and pants. The Sunwuko 2-piece gives you 50% damage reduction while Sweeping Wind is active, and you'll see that this should be all the time. The other major thing that Sunwuko does is the 6-piece, which gives you a 3000% damage buff to Lashing tail kick. As mentioned before, we're combining that with the new Scarbringer. Right now, that's going to increase its damage by 300%. That's down from 1000 when those 96s were done, and it now affects a range of the first 5 to 7 enemies hit. Previously, it was only the first 5 enemies, so while the overall damage buff was nerfed, it's making the skill slightly more effective against groups of enemies. Next item we'll want is Rivera Dancers. These used to be the Bojanglers, but now they kick your Lashing tail kick into overdrive. Next we'll want the Guyana Nakashu. Nakash. You want that thing. While the legendary property might seem lackluster, that's not the important thing. What's important is that as a primary affix, it can roll with increased Lashing tail kick damage ranging from 75 to 100%. Of course, you're going to want that roll to be as high as possible, and this is the reason that we cannot have this item in the cube. Next we'll want Kyoshiro's Soul. This is going to help keep us at maximum Sweeping Wind stacks. And lastly we'll want a Vengeful Wind in order to increase the stack amount of Sweeping Wind. Now going back to the Sunwuko 6-piece bonus. Every time you cast Lashing tail kick, you're going to consume a stack of Sweeping Wind. And if you completely lose Sweeping Wind, you'll be taking double damage because you'll lose that 2-piece set bonus, and you'll no longer be dealing any significant amount of damage because you're losing the 6-piece bonus. So it's critically important to maintain 1 stack of Sweeping Wind at all times. And if you're down to 1 stack, just move away from enemies in order to build up more stacks using Kiroshiros. Once you have a few stacks, you'll naturally gain stacks by landing critical hits. So when you're attacking groups of enemies, you'll virtually never run out of stacks, and the only time you may run out of stacks is if you're fighting a Rift Guardian by himself. For this build, you'll also need an Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac. That's going to bring down the cooldown on some key skills to enable us to maintain the playstyle. For survivability, we've thrown in a Unity. Of course, you need to couple that with a Unity on your follower along with the token that renders them invulnerable. This will effectively double your toughness. You'll note that the gems that we went for in our chest and pants are diamonds. That's because if you're pushing the higher Greater Rifts, survivability can be a bit of an issue with this build, so those diamonds do help. And the diamond in the helm is for that cooldown reduction, which will also want to roll on other gear pieces. A cube item we'll want is the Laws of Seth. This build really chews through spirit quickly. We have no generator and only a spender. With Blinding Flash coupled with that Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac, you'll be able to keep your spirit topped off. For our bracers, I have the Reaper's Wraps equipped, but those aren't optimal. You would ideally likely want to run with either Strong Arm Bracers for more damage, or Ancient Parthens for more survivability. Lastly, for your cubed weapon, you have a few options. We currently see 3 separate 96 Greater Rift clears with different variants of this build that all share many similarities but a few differences. If you cube yourself a Crystal Fist, then you're going the more defensive route. You might also want to do that if you already have a really well-rolled Ancient Crystal Fist and a really bad Scarbringer, then you could instead choose to cube the Scarbringer and wield the Crystal Fist. Similarly, if you have a really bad Vengeful Wind, then you can cube the Vengeful Wind and equip the Scarbringer and the Crystal Fist. But if you have a great Scarbringer and a great Vengeful Wind, then instead of the Crystal Fist, you can go with a Flying Dragon or a Furnace. Both of these options will increase your damage. I initially had a Flying Dragon cubed, but found I lacked some survivability, so I instead opted for the Crystal Fist, which enabled me to progress a little deeper into Greater Rifts. For your legendary gems, you'll of course want a Bane of the Trapped. If you're pushing high Greater Rifts, you'll want a Bane of the Stricken. And then the third gem is a little negotiable. Gogok of Swiftness is really helpful, especially since it got buffed, and now offers a little bit of defense, but mainly thanks to that cooldown reduction it grants. Alternatively, you could go for a Bane of the Powerful. Apart from that, standard gearing rules mostly apply, but because you're a monk, you do want to pay attention to your secondary resistances, and again, with this build, cooldown is important. We'll save the nitty-gritty for a future video if this build is still viable. Onto the skills. This is a fire build, and we'll be using Lashing Tail Kick, Vulture Claw Kick. A variant of this build uses Lashing Tail Kick, Sweeping Armada instead, making it a physical build. Next we go with Dashing Strike, Blinding Speed. Dashing Strike is a terrific mobility skill. You can use it to engage, to disengage, and with this rune you use it as a defensive buff. 40% increased dodge chance after using Dashing Strike. Couple that with the Crystal Fist, and Dashing Strike is doing a huge amount of work to keep you alive. If you want to be a bit more offensive, you could instead go for Radiance to gain that attack speed. If you do go for this though, I would recommend you take the Crystal Fist in your cube. Similarly, if you have a Flying Dragon in your cube, then I would opt for Blinding Speed over Radiance. Next we'll want Sweeping Wind, Inner Storm. Non-negotiable, this gives us some spirit regen, and this really makes us want to maintain at least 3 stacks of Sweeping Wind. Next we'll want Epiphany, Desert Shroud. Epiphany is a crucial skill for monks. Desert Shroud makes it essential to survivability. But if you're feeling particularly ballsy, and feel yourself suffering for spirit, you can try Insight. Next we want Blinding Flash, Faith in the Light. Blinding Flash is essential as our spirit potion, but it also gives a small amount of crowd control, and with Faith in the Light gives us a nice damage buff. Another option though is Replenishing Light. Again, if you're suffering for spirit, you can opt for this. I would argue that if you take Epiphany Insight, taking Replenishing Light as well might be overkill. And another option is actually taking Crippling Light, which helps with survivability. So your options are Faith in the Light for full offense, Crippling Light for full defense, and Replenishing Light for resource management. The final skill is the most negotiable. In this run, I'm using Mantra of Salvation, Agility. This gives us a nice passive toughness boost, with the option to pop the active if you really need it. And the advantage of having a mantra here, versus the other skills we'll go over, is that your Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac will only be triggering off Blinding Flash and Epiphany. In other words, by putting a skill here that does not have a cooldown, you'll be getting to use Blinding Flash and Epiphany more often. So not only are you giving yourself a defensive buff, you are also indirectly giving yourself more resource management by allowing yourself to proc Blinding Flash more often. This should enable you to not have to rely on Replenishing Light for Blinding Flash. Instead of getting more out of every cast of Blinding Flash, you're just casting Blinding Flash more often, and can go, for example, the offensive buff. This also means you'll be benefiting from that offensive buff more often. Another option is to go for Cyclone Strike, Implosion. This is a great crowd control power. Further, it'll trigger your bracers if you have Ancient Parthens or Strong Arm bracers. While this skill does not have a cooldown, it does cost 50 spirit. So it does make this build more spirit thirsty, and so you'd want to go for some of those options that recover more spirit. A final option we'll cover is Inner Sanctuary, Forbidden Palace. This skill does have a cooldown, so this will reduce your uptime on Epiphany and Blinding Flash. However, Inner Sanctuary is a powerful defensive skill. Stand in the circle, take a lot less damage, and with Forbidden Palace, you get a damage buff, and enemies approaching you have their movement speed reduced. Onto the passives. Exalted Soul. We need that spirit regeneration. Beacon of Etar. Reduce cooldowns. We need that to pop our skills more often. Harmony. Essential for monk survivability. Again, this is where those secondary resistances on your gear become important. Then lastly, we can negotiate this one, but we have Determination here. This can give you a nice damage buff. But if you want to go for more survivability instead, you can opt for the Guardian's Path. And another option is Seize the Initiative. If you're not using a Flying Dragon, then you can use this to increase your attack speed. That wraps up this video. Thanks for watching. Remember to check back in the future for any potential updates to this build. I'll leave a note in the description below if the build is just completely nerfed and no longer viable. But if it is still viable, I'll release a new video when the patch goes live, with more details on what the optimum gear, skills, and stats are. Leave a comment with your thoughts on this build, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhyker's Raiders to be alerted when the next Diablo video goes live.